Well, Wuhan has officially been unlocked, according to China. They have been loosening things I've been hearing over the last few weeks in Wuhan. Like, for example, I think there were some people who were allowed to cross into a different province, and there was a video coming out of a clash between the police who didn't want to let people from Wuhan into their province, but now whatever restrictions had remained have been lifted, and apparently Wuhan is back to business. And this is because officially China has their outbreak under control, and magically they just plateaued at 80,000 cases, and things they've slowed their spread in Wuhan, and there's absolutely nothing to worry about. Now, of course, for reasons that I've detailed, numerous times, can't believe the numbers out of China, but if they're reopening Wuhan, then that would tell me at least that whatever their numbers actually are in China must have stabilized to some extent to the point to where they feel like they can control it. And so they're loosening the grip a bit. And so I guess that means that the first wave of the pandemic is over in China. Now, something that I've been also warning about for the past few weeks is that you can't get super excited to see, like we're seeing around the world now, that these places who have been locked down for a little while, and I'll get to Europe and, well, mainly the United States a little later, that they actually are slowing the spread in these places, the lockdown measures. And that is to be expected. If there's nobody interacting with each other, it's going to be hard for the virus to spread. But the risk you run is that once you start opening up the economy again, as China is starting to do, what happens is that all the asymptomatic carriers who have been locked in their homes, not infecting anyone, are going to go back out into the population and start spreading it around again. And so then they're going to create more asymptomatic carriers and, more importantly, more symptomatic people, many of whom will die. And so you will see another spike in the rate of infection, or at least, that's what we would expect. And so China here, even though information is going to be censored, to a very extreme degree, maybe it will give us some indication. We will be able to see if there's some, re-emergence of the virus. Now, the hope is, though, that the second wave, as we would see like in the case of the Spanish flu, should be smaller than the first wave, because there's already so many people, who have gotten this virus and recovered, that they should start to help the community build a sort of herd immunity. So even though the virus will be out and spreading again, it shouldn't spread as quickly or as rapidly. Because if you think about it, the people who have recovered and have acquired immunity, in theory, should act as barriers, between, sick people and people who have not been infected yet in the rest of the community. Because the idea is someone who has already gotten this and recovered shouldn't be able to catch it from a sick person and spread it to other people. The problem with that theory, though, is that something that we've heard on and off about since the start of this virus, and something that we're now hearing about again, thanks to an article in the South China Morning Post, which I believe is a Hong Kong-based paper. They tend to be good for a lot of reporting that is a little more critical of the Chinese government, because they have that shield of some freedom of speech in Hong Kong. And so they cite a study that is coming out recently and shows that a lot of people who have recovered from this virus apparently are not testing positive for antibodies. Because this is, one of the tests. Actually, I discussed this when I was talking about the immunity certificates that the UK wanted to hand out a couple days ago, is that they said, well, we're getting these tests that we're developing to test people for antibodies. And so if you're producing Wu flu antibodies, well, then we can put you back into the general population, and we know you're not going to be able to catch this and spread it to any other people. You're completely, you're a non-entity as far as the epidemic's concerned once you have those antibodies in your system. But since, in this study they're finding people who have gotten it and recovered who don't test positive for antibodies, that would seem to indicate that not everyone who has caught this virus and recovered is contributing to that herd immunity. And what that means is that people might, be able to be infected, 2 or 3 times, or maybe an unlimited amount of times. So it's impossible, or at least very difficult, to build up herd immunity to this, because just getting it once and recovering is not good enough. You might get it the next time, and it might be even worse. And of course, that means that you are still able to spread it around to people. So it might spread just as rapidly or at least close to as rapidly as it did the first time once they unlock this. So the second wave, could be just as bad. Now, one reason that could explain this that is not so frightening is that maybe the antibody tests just don't work well. And so therefore, these wouldn't be a very good test, to use to give people back their freedom, is to say, well, if you test positive in the antibody test, then you're allowed to go back into society. Because if the test is flawed, that could produce false positives or false negatives. In which case, you could be locking up people who are healthy and not a problem, and releasing people who, will be a problem and will contribute to spreading the virus. But assuming that these tests are mostly accurate and that it is in fact true that reports that we were hearing anecdotally before of people being reinfected are in fact true, well then we're going to be in for a rude awakening when we start opening up our countries again and our economies, because we knew from the beginning that doing so would result in a second wave of the outbreak, but we just were hoping that that wave would be smaller. And so the idea is that we could have a few successive waves and each one be smaller until finally we achieve herd immunity or develop some kind of vaccine. And this has relevance to the U.S. because over here in the U.S. Fauci is talking about this morning, and the stock market's so happy to hear from him. He's saying hey, we may be rounding the corner after the end of this week. This might be as bad as things get. Who knows? And that's implying that maybe. If we're rounding the corner now, then maybe we can start talking about opening back up, which he said those talks are ongoing in the administration. Nothing soon, but it's going to happen. Well, if it turns out that they're building up these expectations that hey, everybody's going to be good, we're going to be able to go back to work, we're going to be able to get back to normal, and then they finally do it, and the cases explode again, and they have to shut things down, how hard do you think it's going to be to get people to stop again for a second time? People aren't going to like that. People are going to lose faith in the system. People are not going to trust the government. They might not be as compliant with the lockdowns. I talked about this before any lockdowns happen, that if they're too ambitious with trying to lock people down and keep them home, that they're going to create a lot of problems, and that you might have a significant contingent of people who refuse to comply. And we are seeing that to certain extents here, but they're not enforcing it very strongly. This is mostly a voluntary compliance situation. They haven't been cracking too many skulls of people who've been breaking quarantine in this country. So unfortunately, as I was saying before, China is not going to tell us if anything really bad is going on there, and that they have a huge second wave of infections after they start to open up Wuhan again. But when other Western countries or more open countries such as Italy or Spain or even the U.S. start to unlock their economies and go back to work, we'll see truly, if there's any truth to this whole notion of second infections. Because in these countries, at least, we'll have a little more better data. The testing isn't perfect, but they're not in the same way trying to hide the numbers as directly as China is. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.